I'll start by briefly introducing myself. I'm going to be chairing the event this evening. My name's Kat Moyer-Wolf. I'm an honorary senior lecturer in German at the University of Sydney in Australia. And the topic we're going to be discussing tonight, so the intersections between psychoanalytic ideas and the reality and lived experience of social class, has been at the crux of my own interests for quite some time. As a former academic specializing in Marxist theory and the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, questions of social inequality and how it's created and sustained have always been intellectually and politically important to me. And they're still important to me in my current project to retrain as a clinical psychologist and psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapist here in France, where I live today. So before introducing our speakers, who I'm very, very excited, I'm happy to say it just like that, to be able to bring together because their work has been very influential on me too, as Luke just said. Before introducing them, I think it's worth saying a few words about why we should be interested in thinking psychoanalytically about class and also in thinking about psychoanalysis from the perspective of social class too. In her book on psychoanalysis and social class, Joanna Ryan argues that the elision within psychoanalysis of questions of social inequality can be read as part of our ongoing conscious and unconscious defensive attempts to disavow the existence of social class and class inequality. But class and classism refuse to disappear. And thankfully, psychologists and psychoanalysts in different ways are increasingly engaging with it, therefore. So there's a whole subfield these days of social psychology that deals with social class, including in its critical variant, which, while not directly underpinned by psychoanalytic ideas, is certainly in dialogue with them. And the work of Bridget Rickett, Katie Day, and Maxine Woolhouse deserves to be mentioned here. They've got a great book on critical social psychology of social class. In the UK, the British Psychological Society's Make It 10 campaign aims to have social class included on a list of characteristics protected against discrimination in recognition of the psychological impact of class and classism on individuals, families, and society at large. In France, where I live these days, questions of what the philosopher Chantal Jacquet has called trans-class subjectivity are actually quite prominent in contemporary culture, thanks to the popular success of writers such as Édouard Louis, Didier Eribon, and of course, Annie Ernaux, who recently won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And I think that success confirms, if we needed it to, what we already know, which is that the interest in the psychic dimensions of class and social mobility transcends linguistic and cultural boundaries. In the 18th Brumaire, Marx writes that although we as human beings make our own history, we don't do so as we please. We don't do so under conditions that we choose, but under circumstances that already exist when we come into the world, which have been transmitted from the past. And I read this well-known passage as a kind of reminder that the social structures and relations in and through which class exists are in no small measure the product of unconscious processes, which make social class amenable to psychoanalytic inquiry from the outset. Social class also shapes us unconsciously. Through the dynamics of identification in early life, we acquire and internalize a classed habitus, to speak with Bourdieu, a way of dressing, speaking, thinking, and feeling that bears the hallmarks of a certain class culture. Of course, these elements of class identification intersect with the ways in which we as subjects might be racialized in social space, or the way in which we experience ourselves as sexed and gendered bodies, possessing particular capabilities and perhaps lacking others. The aim of this event tonight then is to, or tonight for me, maybe it's today for where you are, is to explore what a psychoanalytic perspective can reveal about social class, but also to examine how the lived reality of social class can challenge psychoanalysis to self-reflection and conceptual innovation. Not least important here is the question of who has and does not have access to psychoanalytic treatment, which is central to the Red Clinics project. So who has access, how and why, when and where. but also the question of accounting, how accounting for class forces us to rethink psychoanalytic theories and concepts. Vincent de Gaujac has coined the term névrose de classe, or class neurosis, to describe the particular kind of suffering that can occur when trans-class individuals find themselves faced with a conflict between the inherited and acquired aspects of their subjectivity. And this is just one example of what I mean when I talk about conceptual innovation at the intersection between psychoanalysis and social class. We're going to hear about some more conceptual innovations here this evening. So having set the scene a little bit for our discussion, I'd like to introduce our three speakers. I'll introduce all three of them, and then each of them will speak for around 20 minutes. And after that, there'll be some time for discussions and questions. So Elizabeth Ann Danto is Professor Emeritus of Hunter College of the City University, New York. Dr. Danto is a writer and international lecturer on the history of psychoanalysis as a marker of urban culture. Her book, Freud's Free Clinics, Psychoanalysis and Social Justice, 1918 to 1938, with Columbia University Press, won the Gradiva Award and the Goethe Prize. Other books include Historical Research with Oxford University Press and the co-edited Freud/Tiffany, Anna Freud, Dorothy Tiffany Burlingham, and the Best Possible School in Routledge's History of Psychoanalysis series. Lynne Layton is a psychoanalyst who largely disidentifies with being a psychologist. She's on the Grassroots Reparations Campaign Organizing Committee and is co-chair of Boston Workers' Circle's Acting for Racial and Economic Justice Committee. She's taught in women's studies and social studies at Harvard College, and she's taught social psychoanalysis in the community, liberation, indigenous, and eco-psychologies specialization at Pacifica Graduate Institute. Lynne is past president of Section 9 Psychoanalysis for Social Responsibility and was co-editor of Psychoanalysis, Culture and Society from 2004 to 2017. She's the author of Who's That Girl, Who's That Boy? Clinical Practice Meets Postmodern Gender Theory, and with Mariana Levy-Sparunis of Toward Social Psychoanalysis, Culture, Character, and Normative Unconscious Processes, winner of a 2021 Book Award from the American Academy and Board of Psychoanalysis. And finally, Ian Parker is a researcher, supervisor, and consultant in critical psychology and psychoanalysis, and he's a practicing Lacanian psychoanalyst in Manchester in the UK. Ian's a member of the London Society of the New Lacanian School and College of Psychoanalysts. He's also co-director with Erica Berman of the Discourse Unit Research Center, managing editor of the annual review, of critical psychology, and secretary of Manchester Psychoanalytic Matrix, member of the Asylum Magazine editorial collective, and supporter of the Fourth International Organization. I'd like to hand over then to Elizabeth, whose paper is entitled Psychoanalytic Clinics and Attributed Class.
In Vienna of the mid-1920s, the popular idea of transparent man brought together three significant themes: the new household, public welfare and hygiene, and family planning. Though the Nazis would usurp and transform these themes to justify their killing fields a decade later, in 1925, such transparency was a desired metaphor. Psychoanalysis matched up perfectly. Bringing transparency to the mind would free people of neurosis, while at the same time promoting participation in the representative state. With a methodology grounded in early 20th century modernism and infused with the energy of interwar social democracy, psychoanalytic practice was more public than conventional narratives would have us believe. The freestanding figure titled Transparent Man was a three-dimensional sculpture made of clear plastic or glass, generally displayed at health exhibitions, popular during the interwar years. This life-size male form, whether still or mechanized, offered viewers an almost tactical awareness of human health and physiology previously restricted to medical or mortuary personnel. Likewise, psychoanalysis, imbued with modernist qualities of enlightenment and secularism, attracted a broad public interest, in part because it offered non-scientist citizens new ways of seeing into man. Both forms of transparency invited those whose lives had been affected by the war and its subsequent economic and social crises to engage in a new, deeper discourse with body, mind, and ultimately selfhood. Thus mirrored, the viewer could assess their selfhood without a social class attributed by others. This asks us to pose the question, can selfhood exist without an attributed social class? In other words, class is always an attribution, even in the clinic. We are not born with an innate social class, but the class to which we belong depends on the social stratum into which we are born. Sociologists have long investigated the cause and effects of class designations. But that's actually not what we're doing here today. Instead, we are looking at some of what Sigmund Freud said or implied on the issue, 2, the historiography of what Freud said, and 3, the emergence of these ideas in Austria and Germany of the 1920s. One more thought before embarking on Freud. If the self has no innate social class, neither does the unconscious. So this is often lost, but the unconscious self holds no social class. So let's now look at several phrases from Freud's influential Budapest speech of 1918. On the left hand of your screen, you see a photograph of Sigmund Freud from that era, and on the right, the passage translated into English about which I'm going to speak, and in German, the cover, and in the center, the cover of the book as it was published in German. Freud refers to, quote, the women who have nearly succumbed under the burden of their privations, unquote. That is, the ranks of women nearly killed by poverty, deprivation, and patriarchy. They succumb to social pathology, but not to individual psychopathology. For them and others similarly entrapped, Freud approached the creation of free psychoanalytic clinics specifically from a social justice perspective. He said pointedly that poor people, quote, have just as much right to assistance for the mind as they now have to life-saving help offered by surgery. So he was talking about care as a social right, not a philanthropic condescension. Social rights are structured into a nation's social welfare policy and are fundamental aspects of citizenship. Education, for example, is neither a philanthropic gesture nor a commodity to be traded. Education is a social right. Freud acknowledged that, quote, it may be a long time before the state comes to see these duties as urgent. Sometime or other, however, it must come to this, unquote. In other words, the state is responsible for administering the rights of its citizens, though admittedly, the passage then from monarchy to democracy, what we might call conservative to progressive today, would follow a learning curve. This changeover would facilitate the patient's right to care, regardless of their attributed social class. Freud never once, that I know of, used either the word or the patronizing concept of philanthropy, nor did he mention individual psychopathology in this context. Indeed, the clinics would shift free mental health treatment from the paternalism of individual charity to a broad social welfare paradigm, the welfare of society as a whole. And that is social justice. To understand why we are just beginning to discuss the idea of social justice as an underlying premise of the free clinic, we need now to look at the historiography of psychoanalysis, not just the movement's official history, but how that history has been written. Like many misunderstandings of Freud, this may well started with Ernest Jones. Quote, "In your private political opinions, you might be a Bolshevist," Jones wrote to Freud in 1926, "but you would not help the spread of psychoanalysis to announce it." Jones was Freud's first biographer, as we know, and his influence swayed our understanding of Freudian theory for decades. Here he is outraged by his discovery of the political nature of Freud's thought. And unfortunately, historians of psychoanalysis have largely followed Jones' lead or mislead in the area of patient class until quite recently. And hopefully today's conference is a sign that Jones' influence is losing steam. But any number of today's scholars still deny precisely the social role occupied by the original free psychoanalytic clinics. For example, you can look up the Wikipedia article on the Berlin Clinic and see that the author has detailed its training function, but the provision of treatment as a social mission is not mentioned, not once. So on your left, you have a slide of the outer office and possibly the director's office of the Berlin Polyclinic in the early 1920s. I placed that in 1924. Your center slide is of 29 Potsdamer Straße in what became East Berlin and is now reverted to Berlin as such. And I just put in this other slide of 1934, merely 10 years later, to give us a reminder, should we need it, of what happened under the Nazis. So this was the Weimar era, the Weimar Republic era, Germany's interwar era of cultural innovation, a Bauhaus design, complicated democracy, and a wide range of progressive social reforms. Not as extensive as Vienna's, but definitely there. Contrary to some historians who claim that the Berlin Clinic was merely a laboratory for the training institute, we have empirical data that emphasizes its social dimension. In mid-July 1919, for example, Max Eitingon, its director, wrote to Freud, quote, "Last Saturday, our association decided to open a psychoanalytic polyclinic in Berlin next winter. We will therefore start our psychotherapy for the people without waiting for the state itself rebuilding to give us the means to pursue this goal." No sooner had the polyclinic opened that the analysts were ready to treat homeless people, abused women, and orphan children, and more. Again, there is not a hint of philanthropic posturing in sight. So here we have it. The clinic was launched by experienced analysts for people of all occupations, ages, genders, and attributed class. As Eitingon would write later, patients pay whatever they can or think they can. Thus, it is both incorrect and classist to say that the clinic was set up as a feeder for the training institute. It is equally classist to assert that people must pay for the treatment as though treatment itself were a capitalist investment. Perhaps because they were so precisely attuned to class, Berlin's clinical staff was remarkably creative. By the early 1920s, they had advanced not only free treatment, but also length of treatment guidelines, time-limited and short-term treatment, and the active technique. I will now briefly review these innovations. So on your images here on the upper left, you have Helene Deutsch, who was in Berlin just a couple of years. Below her, you have Erich Fromm, To Fromm's right, you have Karen Horney, and above Karen Horney, you have an agenda from Melanie Klein. I hope it's not, the right-hand side isn't obscured, but in her handwriting, she lists her patients. She's in Berlin at this point, and under that, she lists how much of what she earned from the patients go to the polyclinic. They had a very interesting system there. So the polyclinic did indeed treat people gratis. A sliding scale of fees was drafted, and patients were expected in one way or another to pay whatever they estimated they could afford. Many did so when others, like students, unemployed, or simply indigent people who could not afford treatment, were analyzed free of charge. An individual was admitted to treatment on the basis of diagnostic need alone, so that the mere ability to pay did not determine access to therapy. The patient's own report on their financial status was believed. Whether or not they were able to pay or said they were able to pay was not important, or rather, as Eitingon pointed out again, they could pay as much or as little as they can or think they can, because clinically we know the difference. And that was more important as a practitioner's clinical issue than an administrator's. This decision made separated social class from treatment fees. As the length of treatment guidelines, again, separating these two, can individual treatment be shortened or speeded up? Is the therapy hours 60 minutes or 45, or could it vary? Are such decisions best made by the patient or the clinician? These moral and practical controversies were argued often, though inconclusively, by the staff. They refused to implement our a priori time limits on treatment, regardless of diagnosis. Analysts came to view length of treatment as patient-driven, or, failing that, a mutual decision between therapist and patient. The third item I want to talk about briefly is time-limited or fractionary analysis. The concept of time-limited analysis allowed for both patient self-determination and clinical flexibility. And the reason I put these two slides up, the left one is indeed a treatment room from the Berlin clinic. And this is just a small aside, but I had always wondered who had developed, who had made official the format in terms of sort of culture, the form of the psychoanalytic couch. And Freud's youngest son, Ernst, was an architect who also designed furniture. So I thought that he had designed it. And fortunately, our colleague, Volker Welter, found this drawing, which is probably the original drawing of the analytic couch. And that's just interesting. But to come back to the fractionary analysis, as early as 1922, the method of fractionary analysis meant stopping or interrupting the analysis, quote, when improvement in the patient's condition shows that he has attained a considerable measure of efficiency and capacity for life. Implicitly, the analytic process can move forward on a fractionary basis once, or if, social class and power differentials are addressed by the dyad. We have heard how, just generally speaking, people say, well, we heard that how, quote, lower class patients, quote, need short-term treatment. This is, of course, a projection associated with an attribution of class. and it is merely that and not a mutual decision between analyst and patient concerning the method of fractionary or time-limited analysis. Ferenczi wrote, "The setting free of the patient's critical feelings and the willingness on our part to admit our mistakes and the honest endeavor to avoid them in the future, all these go to create in the patient a confidence in the analyst," unquote, and hopefully vice versa. This phrase could well apply to transference and countertransference projections of social class. 100 years later, fractionary or short-term therapy remains widely used. The active technique emerged from discussions between Freud and Ferenczi, who is now viewed as its pioneer and arguably the most radical clinical theorist of the first generation. For instance, he viewed alcoholism as a social disorder. And in a letter to Freud, he said that psychoanalysts, quote, "investigate the real conditions in the various levels of society, cleansed of all hypocrisy and conventionalism, just as they are mirrored in the individual." Ferenczi observed the therapeutic relationship meticulously. He focused on empathy and mutuality as clinical instruments, especially in the moment-to-moment reactions between therapist and patient. An analyst who associates neurosis with either a lower or an upper class compromises the treatment. And alcoholism, for example, would not be class-based. The ambulatorium, the free clinic supported by Sigmund Freud and the larger Social Democratic Party in Vienna, advanced its own practice innovations. For example, a child guidance center, a department for the treatment of psychoses, and community-based counseling centers in Greater Vienna. The clinic was well known in the city, and its assistant director, Wilhelm Reich, confronted class issues arguably more directly than most. So we have here an image of the of Wilhelm Reich in his late 20s, and below him is the staff of the clinic, and in the center is Reich, who was then the clinic's assistant director. And much of the case material we read in his books, like the Sexual Revolution, the function of the orgasm, and so forth, comes from that clinic. And this I find is an interesting example of how widespread and accepted psychoanalysis was in Vienna of the era, that is to say, on the progressive side, not the increasing fascistic side. This is a clipping from a local newspaper called Psychoanalysis for the Destitute. If anybody's interested, I have the transcription and translation of that, which I can send you. At any rate, for Rice, like for Ferenczi, what mattered was the actual meaning as reflected in the patient's behavior. As he said, to know how to deal with inhibited or silent patients was the most difficult. The patient is late to their appointment, or arrogant, or bored, or criticizes the analyst. How do we understand these gestures in terms of the class relationship to the analyst? These are things that Anna Freud might rename later ego defenses. But whether they're an ego defense or contained within the class relationship, which is something that's underexplored, every resistance has a historical and an actual meaning. How patients say things is at least as important as what they say. On the one hand, Reich said, quote, "Material poverty and lack of opportunities exacerbate the emotional suffering and neurotic symptoms of poor people, unquote. On the other hand, it was precisely because he treated poor and disenfranchised groups like laborers, farmers, students, and servants, people without the kind of education or vocabulary that could mask a symptom, that Rice learned to differentiate between symptom neurosis and disturbances in character. He sought to treat patients who had been diagnosed as psychopaths, but were regarded as morally bad rather than sick. So we need to ask ourselves from that, is psychopathology all too frequently an indication of class status? Today, for example, homeless people are often, or all too often, I should say, deemed mentally ill because they lack fixed shelter. And shelter is a marker of social class. So a real estate issue transmutes into a diagnosis of a person for whom housing may mean the very opposite of its class designation. It may mean safety or community or liberation from childhood trauma. We don't know that, however, because once again, the unconscious does not have a social class. Ernst Simmel, who was the Polyclinic's co-director, explored the following paradox. Quote, at the Berlin Institute, we fulfill duties that are actually in the service of society, unquote. But this is the same society which inflicts such high social demands on poor people that they develop neuroses, and whose cultural demands push the neurotic further into poverty and then abandons him to the pain, unquote. The clinic, therefore, has the dual role of helping society as a whole while remedying individual human pain caused by society's own challenges. That the clinic plays a role in distributive justice underscores the emancipatory nature of psychoanalysis. Is this radical? Is freedom of mind really so radical? In brief, Simmel is saying that the clinic exists to help people in pain, whether this results from internal or external processes. Psychoanalytic help is not predicated on social class. So Simmel was co-director of the Polyclinic. He was director of Schloss Tegel, which was the first inpatient psychoanalytic facility. And he was also the director of the Socialist Physician, both the journal and the society. And we have on the left a page from their journal. And of course, on the right, we have Simmel and Sigmund Freud sitting on a bench at Schloss Tegel. Simmel called on theory, specifically on the synergy between psychoanalysis and the class struggle, to draw a contrast between the bourgeois medical paradigm of individual patient, individual physician, and the socialist paradigm of groups, medical teams, and patient communities. The psychological precariousness of the analytic patient, whose depression is compounded by poverty, is akin to that of a woman in childbirth, he said. Both deserve more than faceless compassion and bourgeois sympathy, regardless of their ability to pay. Just as Freud had held that the neurosis threatened the public health no less than tuberculosis, unquote, so depriving poor people of the liberating effects of psychoanalysis was the epitome of class oppression, according to Simmel. Thus, Simmel's challenge was not so much making sure that poor people got care, but that individual care could be justified ideologically. In one sense, he wanted bourgeois privileges for his patients, but he also believed deeply that the, quote, fundamentally egalitarian nature of psychoanalysis, unquote, would alter this practice dilemma that even in the 1960s, radical analysts like R.D. Laing failed to resolve. The free clinic offered a new model of practice outside both the private office and traditional psychiatric hospitals. Sigmund Freud viewed access to health and mental health care as a social right. His colleagues, like Josef Friedjung, who wrote Social Aspects of Pediatrics, championed those whom the bourgeoisie cast off as morally undeserving or economically irresponsible: destitute families, lonely and suicidal children, unemployed men, the very populations who would lose access to psychoanalytic treatment were it not a social right. If psychoanalysis is the great theory of emancipation, and if freedom lies at the core of democracy, then mental health care as a social right is the bridge between the two. In keeping with what Freud spearheaded, psychoanalysis is a form of social justice activism built on free clinics that make mental health treatment available to all, regardless of gender, age, occupation, or social class. Transparent man. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was absolutely great. What a way to open the talks tonight. I think you might have to pass over hosting back to Luke.
That's okay. I've got it. Thank you.
Oh, you've got it. Okay.
You got it? Okay, great.
Okay.
Yeah, my internship starts
So
next week, but the week after.
if everyone could maybe mute their microphones, I think
I'll be
you
working
can
in a
hear one or
document
two people in the background.
And then I have a gig tonight for photo and for photography and like videography.
Okay, well, I'd like to hand over to Lynne next. And the title of Lynne's paper is Unconscious Reproductions of Class Inequality in Clinic and Culture. So Lynne, over to you.
Thank you so much. Luke, if you can make me the host, that would be great so I can share my screen. So I had forgotten that I said that I disidentify as being a psychologist, but I did say that. And partly that's because I had the good fortune of training in comparative literature first, before I trained as a psychologist. And in the era that I trained, which was the 70s, there was a great fervor on the left around ideology critique, Marxist ideology critique. For example, Althusser talking about how subjects are interpolated into class positions. Kat, you had mentioned Bourdieu, who talked about the internalization not just of class position, but of class struggle. And then Gramsci and Stuart Hall, who moved the class analysis intersecting with race. And all of these people that I've mentioned have had feminist interpreters who speak to the interpolation into positions of gender and sexuality as well. Also influenced by Frankfurt School, particularly Erich Fromm. So having been interested always in how the outside gets inside, finding in my psychology training that no one was really all that interested in that, except with regard to the family, I started to translate some of this work that I had studied in the 70s and 80s into the clinic. And I'll first describe how I came to it. A student of mine and I came upon a paper in the 90s that was a long extended clinical vignette by a male analyst and a female patient. I can't go into the whole thing, but what was very clear as we looked at this case was that in interpretations, in what he said and what he didn't say, what he says to the reader versus what he said to the patient, he was very clearly interpolating her into a particular position in a heterosexist, unequal status, where he was the autonomous one, for example, she was the dependent one. And so I began to think of how therapists unwittingly, sometimes unconsciously reproduce. I call it a heterosexist unconscious, but later also influenced by things like the Combahee River Collective. I began to recognize the intersectional nature of this, and people, clinicians in the school that I'm most identified with, relational psychoanalytic theory, began talking about racial enactments in the clinic, not class enactments, actually, racial, gender, sexuality, not class. So I changed the appellation from normative unconscious, from heterosexist unconscious as a substance to normative unconscious processes to capture the reproduction of these unequal relations of classism, class, race, gender, sexuality in the clinic. Sometimes the patient does it, sometimes the therapist does it, and sometimes it's collusion between the two. Then by the early 2000s, I'd say, or like maybe after the financial meltdown and then Occupy, I belatedly started to recognize that we were in a particular conjuncture. And having been influenced, as I said, by Erich Fromm around ideas of both social unconscious and social character, I started thinking about our current conjuncture, which is neoliberal racial capitalism as the dominant socioeconomic formation that was influencing character and unconscious process. So in neoliberalism, humans are conceived of, oh, you know what, I have to admit people into the room. Sorry. In neoliberalism, humans are conceived of as competitive, as competing for scarce resources, and human worth is measured by wealth. A dominant psychic marker, in my opinion, of neoliberal individualism is a character structure marked by defensive autonomy. That is, by a disavowal of dependence and interdependence, a repudiation of vulnerability shameful, a disavowal of one's formation in relationships and ongoing sustenance by relationships. It is the structure that's long been idealized for white upper class, well, for white men in general, for example, in such figures as the lone cowboy, the hard-boiled detective, the lone entrepreneur. But in neoliberalism, it became the ideal subject position for anyone who could attain it. And starting in the 90s, it became more attainable for educated white women, including those who came from the working class. Indeed, actually, in the 90s, I noticed in both my patients and my students that there was they no longer identified with the idealized woman of my era, the relational female, but rather with a male defensive autonomy. So I'm going to give some clinical and cultural examples of the psychic effects of neoliberal dominance in different class strata. And I'm going to start with a vignette that speaks to how one of my working class female patients who grew up in the neoliberal 80s and 90s was eagerly trying, in the words of another patient who was working class and much more conflicted about moving up in class, spoke of as jumping class. In other words, to professionalize and become wealthy. So I'm calling this patient Sandy. Sandy was born in the late 1970s, the first child of a white mother who grew up in poverty and a white father who rose from blue collar to bureaucratic white collar. Father never let mother forget where she came from, and much of Sandy's specialness to father was wrapped up in his often stated aspiration that she rise in class and status. Because she was so special, he asserted, she could do and have whatever she wanted. Intuiting this source of her father's love, Sandy worked much harder academically than any of her peers, and she did indeed rise to become a professional in a high-income field. She thus secured her place as her father's favorite, which unfortunately psychically involved denigrating her mother. What Sandy always knew, but couldn't really know until therapy, is that her father's capacities for love were rather damaged, and a part of her greatly resented what felt like a love contingent on performance. Her fragile sense of specialness was bolstered by her utter disdain, and disdain is key, if you read Bourdieu and his feminist interpreters, key to a habitus based in distinction. Disdain for peers who didn't work as hard as she did. Someday they'll be cleaning my toilets, she thought, when she saw them out having fun while she studied. Now, Sandy fell in love with a working class man who himself had risen to be bureaucratic white collar. As her therapist, I listened over and over again to her mocking denigration of his working class ways. I surmised that Sandy thought she was bonding with me and, in her view, my exalted class position when she was denigrating the classlessness of her boyfriend. But of course, it was her own anxiety about not being classy enough that she feared would be revealed, and dreams did at times reveal it. I found it difficult to listen to how she talked about her boyfriend. For me, it was like nails on a chalkboard. And at the point where I could no longer bear her contempt and could find a way to confront it calmly, I pointed out to her that she seemed to need to mock her boyfriend, and we ought perhaps look at why. The first time I brought this up, she practically had an anxiety attack on the couch. She had an instant moment of recognition that, in fact, much of her sense of who she was, her identity, and she used that term, rested on this defensive kind of class mockery. And she suddenly felt herself unraveling at the prospect of being shorn of this defense. It took a lot of work to understand how her class grandiosity related to class disidentifications with her mother and identifications with her father's disdain for what in the mother reminded him of his own, too much of his own disowned class insecurities. But she eventually came to understand how the class grandiosity was a defense against recognizing that her father's love was contingent on her achievements. Her mockery was aimed as much at hated parts of herself that she had come to associate with classlessness as at her boyfriend. Now, class wounds run deep. When it feels like love is contingent on performance, love itself gets tangled up in sadomasochistic enactments. Indeed, until she met this boyfriend, Sandy was entirely cynical about love. For years, she'd been cheating on her previous upper middle class boyfriend with a lower class man she'd dated in high school. This, I thought, was perhaps another way of externalizing and interpersonalizing her own internal class struggle that she couldn't deal with as something internal. But Sandy was aided in her denigration of love by a fairly new subject position offered to professionalizing women, one formed at the intersection of neoliberalism and a white middle class version of feminism. This is a subject position in which dependency is denied and caretaking capacity is devalued in favor of a single-minded focus on career goals. And indeed, before analysis, Sandy occupied this position without seeming conflict. In her determination to rise in class, Sandy had become the non-relational maximizer of self-opportunity described in critiques of neoliberalism. She had come to hate her own vulnerability and to project it onto her boyfriend and lower classes in general. But we might guess that she fell in love with this boyfriend, in part because he was comfortable with his class, with all that she had come to call not me, even though she would try to get me to laugh at him, with her at him for wearing a gold chain or showing some other sign of belonging to the white working class. Sandy's case suggests that to sustain the identity position that received love and approval, she continuously had to split off and project onto others the parts of self that came to be labeled bad me or not me. Like Erich Fromm, I'm arguing that the reason one would do this damage to oneself is because it's too dangerous to lose the love and approval on which in part the stability of our developing identities depend. But identities formed in this way are also defensive and fragile, haunted by what has been split off. Sandy tried to enlist me as her classy accomplice, but in this case, I wasn't pulled in. Later, I'll talk about a case where I was. Now, a bit more now about social character and neoliberalism. Neoliberal practices encouraging the development of entrepreneurial selves became dominant in the US and UK during the Reagan and Thatcher administrations, when social welfare for the vulnerable, formerly seen as the responsibility of the state, began to be shifted onto the shoulders of individuals. The privatization and marketization of public goods like healthcare and education, deregulation, downsizing, outsourcing, the financial crisis of 2007, and dramatic increases in income inequality have caused tension between the demand to be entrepreneurial and the fear of falling, failing, being disposable. On the micro level of subject formation, neoliberalism and the attendant governmental refusal to be a holding environment has created a great deal of anxiety about class status among all classes, including the middle and upper middle classes that I generally treated in private practice. The psychic effects of neoliberalism on the white middle and upper middle class in the US are in some ways different and in some ways similar to Sandy's experience. While Sandy's parents demanded that she rise in class, white middle class parents in the US since the 90s have become anxious about remaining middle class. Seeing economic precariousness all around them, they harbor a fear of falling into a lower class, which has led many of them to embrace neoliberal ideas about maximizing self-interest. In neoliberalism, every aspect of private life is, as Reid has said, quote, charted according to a calculus of maximum output for minimum expenditure. Everything can be seen as an investment, unquote. Many of my middle and upper middle class patients talk about maximizing effectiveness and optimizing just about everything. Most of them seem to feel a sense of virtue when they run themselves ragged, and a sense of shame and anxiety about just sitting around and experiencing what we used to call downtime. When achievement is experienced as a demand for manic activity, downtime, the split-off alternative, is experienced as shameful laziness. Neoliberalism thus exacerbates tendencies, I think, to adopt a manic defense against need, which intensifies what Bourdieu so well described as a middle-class habitus built on distinction. I'm going to end with a vignette of my work with a white middle-class adult patient who was born in the early 80s. This patient once reported that her educated middle-class parents, perhaps a slightly earlier version of Grover's parents, had throughout her childhood made it clear to her that she had two options in life, Yale or jail, a formulation that presciently described the racialized character of neoliberalism with its mass incarceration largely falling on African-American men. Unlike in the Sandy vignette, where I was able to resist engaging in an unconscious reproduction of classism, in this vignette, I indeed was complicit in sustaining the binary products of gender, race, sexual, and class splitting, reenacting rather than analyzing what had caused psychic distress in the first place. And just to connect back with Elizabeth's talk, Ferenczi is also a really important ancestor for me because he spoke about power in the clinic and that the therapist has an unconscious as well. There's always two unconsciouses in the room. So no matter what class they come from, many of my patients are conflicted about what they're entitled to have. When they get something good, they often feel guilty about it, in some cases feeling they have coerced the other into giving it. A middle-class white female patient had at an early age become ashamed of what she felt family members condemned as too much desire for attention. When I began seeing her, she was in fact quite constricted. Sometime during our work together, I moved into a home office, which I had decorated in higher style than the office I was renting. In our first meeting in the new office, the theme of entitlement and selfishness arose. The patient spoke about having just read Barbara Ehrenreich's book, Nickel and Dimed, and said she felt guilty and indulgent about having hired a maid for the first time. I said, "It's hard to acknowledge that you're privileged." She agreed and held out her hands to show me her nails, which she had recently had done in clear polish. She said, "I get my nails done. I have a therapist in Brookline in a place like this." My own privilege having been invoked, I think I felt quite anxious and did not know what to do with the guilt over privilege, hers, mine, ours. I remember having tried to normalize her privilege, saying something like, "You don't have to feel guilty for having nice things." I think this comment closed down something the patient was trying to say, something that went against the neoliberal grain because it attempted to connect her fortune to the misfortune of others. My first comment kept the question of privilege open. The second one closed it down. Of course, clinicians need to understand a patient's tendencies to self-denial and guilt over wanting a better life. But I think there was also something significant to explore here about our mutual discomfort about our privilege and its connection to the lack of privilege all around us. I'm suggesting that normalizing privilege is perhaps a neoliberalizing practice that keeps class inequality in place. It is a challenge to keep the fact of our privilege alive in our thoughts and feelings, not to close it down with either guilt or entitlement. As Joanna Ryan, who I'm happy to see has joined us today, has said, class inequalities are perpetuated by therapists who cannot acknowledge that such inequalities exist or cannot deal with their own feelings about class inequality. I'm going to end there. I don't have time to give a counterexample, which I would suggest reading Nancy Hollander's paper, Who is the Sufferer and What is Being Suffered, to see how a therapist can resist colluding with the gender, race, class, sexual orientation, reproduction of inequalities. But I don't have time to do that. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Lynn. Hopefully we might get time to come back to some of these issues in the discussion. And that talk was also great. The really rich clinical material makes class in the clinic very live. Do you want to hand back over to Luke the hosting?
Okay, I've got it, thanks.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'll hand over to our final speaker, Ian Parker now. And Ian's paper is simply titled Class and the Clinic.
Okay, thanks, Kat, and thanks so much for to Elizabeth and Lynne for those really interesting talks. Well, there are many ways of conceptualizing class in the clinic, and I'm going to have intersectional approaches to different forms of exploitation and oppression in mind as I address this question. Marxism is one obvious reference point. I'm glad that Kat quoted Marx at the beginning. And Marxism is what I'm going to be foregrounding here. I'm most interested in the links between a Marxist understanding of class and psychoanalytic work. Now, one of the most important underlying assumptions that we need to make when we attempt to link Marxism and psychoanalysis in relation to class is that there's a necessary and ineliminable interrelation between what is objective, the actual existing world, which structures what is possible and impossible, and subjectivity, what we think and feel about the world, our subjective engagement with others, are intimate parts of the external reality that we attempt to fit into or rail against. And that assumption should underlie clinical psychoanalysis itself. That is, we attend to subjectivity in the clinic and take seriously what patients and analysans are embedded in. Now, it's important to remember this in what follows, for we often have to clear our way through caricatures of psychoanalysis, which analysans and sometimes analysts bring into the clinic. And when we step back and think about class, we also have to work our way through caricatures of Marxism. Needless to say, Marxism usually trades in caricatures of psychoanalysis as being a bourgeois science, which reduces everything to what is happening inside the individual, inflates the role of subjectivity to make it the only touchstone, and psychoanalysis repays the favor, finding ways of explaining or even pathologizing adherence to political worldviews to attempts to change the world. So what is class? for Marxists, and how might that help us think about class in the clinic? Well, first, class is not, for Marxists, it's not a sociological category. It's not a substantive entity that can be mapped in surveys, still less in measures of styles of life or from self-report questionnaires. And neither do certain kinds of ideas about identity or politics flow immediately from class membership as defined in many forms of sociological research. And something that bedevils such sociological approaches, including, it should be said, some self-defined Marxist forms of sociology, is precisely that intertwining of subjectivity and objectivity. What people think about their class membership does not necessarily correspond to their actual class position, and by the same token, defining and then informing people about what class they really are does not clear things up. We already know this well in the clinic, even if we're not Marxists. The contradictory forms of subjectivity that are explored in the clinic are not amenable to some objective, corrective explanation of how things are and what people are. Rather, for Marxists, class is a relation between contending forces of ownership and labor. And this first principle of Marxist analysis of class opens the way to thinking about how that relation is mediated by different kinds of institution, including workplaces, trade unions, political parties, and psychoanalytic clinics. It's a particular kind of relation, and this specifies it as to do with ownership and labor. Class is an economic relation to production. Under capitalism, which is what Marxism is primarily concerned with, that economic relation must, of course, include aspects of life that Marx himself did not get around to analyzing thoroughly, such as the way that consumption is also powered by the drive for profit, is part of the production process. Consumption is such a potent part of the production process that the term prosumption has been coined to try and grasp that. And production, we know, is not only what happens inside the factory. That's something that socialist feminists have explored in discussions of social reproduction in and alongside families. And that aspect includes the global care chains that embed our everyday lives in the history of colonialism and imperialism. We can already notice this too in the clinic, where forms of alienation, as is estrangement from creative work, becomes tied to distress, distress as protest, and sometimes also as compensation for exploitation and oppression. Flights into health and into illness are bound up with this. Different forms of alienation and distress operate according to gendered and racialized relations to production. That is, according to what our work is for us and for others. We notice this in the clinic, but what do we do with it? It's here that Marxism starts to become a problem for psychoanalytic work. Both psychoanalysis and Marxism treat interpretation of the world as always a means to change it, to affirm it or change it. But Marxist conceptions of class have certain aims that go above and beyond what usually happens inside the clinic. And this again is to do with the relation between objectivity and subjectivity, something that weaves together interpretation and change in Marxism. For there is, for us Marxists, a dialectical interconnection between what we know and where we stand. What we do know, and this is analytically worked up in our analysis and understanding of capitalism, is that the working class is configured as a potential agent of change. Its relation to production is such that it has the capacity to take ownership of the means of production because it is the productive class. Dialectically speaking, if you'll forgive a little jargon for the moment, the working class thereby becomes object and subject of the history of class struggle. The working class becomes, as capitalism is installed as the dominant political economic system of production, it becomes a class in itself, as if it is a substantive thing. And through collective struggle, then it becomes a class for itself, conscious of its agency. And we need to notice at least two things about this process. One is that what it is to be working class, to be a class that is accorded and accords itself agency to interpret and change the world, is collective in nature. And the human being thereby also realizes its own nature as a social being. The other thing to notice is what capitalism does to us, always did, and does all the more efficiently and insidiously now. Capitalism individualizes, and now neoliberal capitalism strips away collective welfare support so that our potential human nature is betrayed, distorted, and from that process issued many of the kinds of distress we meet in the clinic, the kinds of things that Lynne was talking about. What we think we know is always, whether we like it or not, connected to where we stand. And this must be the case if we're good Marxists, keen to develop our theoretical standpoint as one which is from the standpoint of the working class. It's also the case if we come into psychoanalysis because we're moved by distress and want to find the way to listen to and work with the speech of an analysand, resisting the temptation to tell them what we think will make them happy, but also, in some peculiar dialectical way, working with what they know, with the standpoint they occupy as subjects. So this is a crunch point. And sometimes this is where an activist conception that is working from the standpoint of the working class as a necessarily collective phenomenon formed in relation to production under capitalism, that's where it collides with a psychoanalytic conception, even for psychoanalysts who think of themselves as activists. And we have to deal with this collision, this contradiction inside the clinic. And that is something Marxists who are going into the clinic to work as psychoanalysts repeatedly face. And we have to work out how to deal with this outside the clinic, something that psychoanalysts who are coming out of the clinic to work as Marxists face. Now, the way I framed it here is as if there is a necessary division of labor, as if those two forms of work are divided from each other. And it's true that aspects of the external world, including class relations, enter into the clinic. And that what we say inside the clinic filters out into the world. It has effects there. But there is something intrinsically valuable about forming and maintaining the space of the clinic as a qualitatively different space to speak. For Marxists going into the clinic as psychoanalysts, they must hold the frame, the clinical frame, in order for psychoanalysis to take place. And there's a conflict at the heart of clinical work that cannot be solved by simply fusing the two domains of speaking of distress inside the clinic and acting to change the world outside it. And we have to approach this conflict as a contradiction. We have to deal with it dialectically. There's something of this conception of it as a dialectical process that marks psychoanalysis out from most forms of psychotherapy, from those forms of therapeutic work that attempt to heal the split between conscious and non-conscious experience. That also marks Marxism out from many other forms of leftist politics, the forms of political activity that would attempt to dissolve conflict into dialogue between contending parties. Some kinds of demands are put aside in the clinic, but other expectations come into play. We hear class relations spoken of, and they're reenacted in the clinic in transference. This is apparent in the way assumptions about the supposed knowledge or the lack of knowledge on the part of the analyst are referred to. We hear it in assumptions about what the psychoanalytic process will achieve, and that may tie identification with the analyst to notions of class mobility and perceived success, something that Lynne described so well. Payment here is double-edged, increasingly now feeding elements of prosumption that give the illusion of individualized agency and choice that is disconnected from the production process, apparently disconnected from it. And the double-edged nature of payment itself reflects and replicates who does what with money in capitalist society. It reflects and replicates class relations. On the one hand, payment is supposed to accord agency to a consumer, and handing over the money for analysis can itself be a condescending exercise of power for an analyst who must work for a living. On the other hand, payment can be offered as hard-won, scarce commodity given to another in desperate conditions, subjecting the analysand to conditions of a renter, of enclosed resources that are corralled by an analyst who gathered them to themselves by paying for professional training. Again, this is an instance of where consciousness cannot be directly read off from class position. Neither can an analyst inside the clinic assume that the position of the analysand is necessarily that of an arrogant benefactor or a dependent supplicant. Exploration of the entwinement of class relations with transferential dynamics has to be case by case, listening to the different distinct subjective takes on objectively existing structures of power that are themselves infused with subjectivity. What comes into play there are the array of the hidden injuries of class and how the analyst may be positioned as yet another emblem of humiliating confirmation of an analysand's abject, exploited working class experience. What is at issue here is not how the analyst deliberately elicits talks of such things, but how they attend to them when they do appear. Hidden injuries of class intersect with hidden embodied injuries of race, sex, gender, and the speaking of them operates inside the clinic through transference, and so also through forms of identification with the analyst as interlocutor, perceived variously as superior or inferior, and forms of projection of those qualities onto the analyst. The response to such speech also needs to be handled in transference in the frame of the clinic. Now, the other side of the question is, for psychoanalysts coming out of the clinic to work as Marxists, there's a corresponding, though qualitatively different set of tasks. Key to that activity is an understanding of the collective nature of working class resistance as it travels from consciousness of itself to becoming an agent of change, acting on its own behalf, for itself. That collective aspect is stalled, limited inside the clinic, but it can be realized, expressed, developed in relation to the clinic as an institution. Everything about the structure of the clinic, ranging from dynamic administration of the setting, to the training and accreditation institutions, to the way psychoanalysis is spoken about as a cure, is actually already, in some ways, collective. Administrative arrangements are necessarily infused with class relations, and to speak about such things is sometimes viewed as an affront by those who are challenged precisely because they connect with what is objective, real, with what is subjective, felt. Collectivizing the institutions while guaranteeing the integrity of clinical space, precisely in order to guarantee the integrity of the clinical space, is a political act. It will involve those who in other places speak as analysands, as well as those who listen as psychoanalysts. And that entails handling in our Marxist relationship to institutions exactly the kind of multiple and contradictory embodied positions that we anticipate our analysans to experience inside the clinic. We do not only speak of who we are, whether that is inside the clinic in analysis or outside the clinic in the political realm, but of what we've been made to be and what we do with that as we aim to be something different. That activity needs to be public and visible, and it entails challenge to existing class-structured institutions that reproduce different kinds of privilege, and the building of alternative institutions so that exit from the clinic is not only exit from personal analysis into acceptance of the world, but the possible continuation of analysis by other means, political analysis and praxis. That means, of course, that there will be effects inside the clinic that need to be handled within the frame in transference with our political sensitivity to the historical and current constitution of the clinic, alerting us to the way expressions of working class experience and identity are too often dismissed or derogated by psychoanalysts who tend to speak of poverty, for example, in terms of poverty of affect instead of material class exploitation. So, to wind up, we have to be able to hold in tension radical work inside and outside the clinic. We will be attending to class experience and identity inside the clinic as a potent, disabling and enabling force without assuming that we as analysts know how they will be subjectively felt or enacted in relation to us. And outside the clinic, we will be addressing the class structure of institutionalized psychoanalytic provision. That means both holding the analytic frame and stepping back from it, clearly engaging in both tasks. So what there is of class consciousness inside the clinic, as well as consciousness of other forms of oppression, is developed, realized as a collective process outside it. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Ian. That was a great account of what class, the reality of class, the concept of class, particularly from a Marxist perspective, has to say to psychoanalytic theory, but above all practice, how it makes us reconsider what those things mean. Thanks to all three speakers for those papers. They were really fantastic, individually and together. We do have time for some questions and discussion now. So if people who are listening would like to write questions in the chat, or if you'd like to ask questions verbally, it'd be great if people who do want to intervene could turn on their cameras while they ask their questions to our speakers. But you're not obliged to if you don't want to. So we've received a question in the chat from Dick Blackwell, and I'll read it out. So it's significant, is it significant, that none of the speakers has explicitly declared their own class roots and class identity and thereby their positionality? Is the term lower class at all problematic? Okay, so there's a series of questions actually here, which are all very interesting and connected. Maybe we can start with that first question. It is an interesting one. Is it significant? Do our speakers think it's significant that none of us began by saying where we come from or where we think we stand in terms of class? Perhaps, Ian, you would have something to say to that as our most recent speaker.
I can see Lynne's hand up, fortunately.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, you're doing my job for me, so that's good. Lynne, would you like to respond?
I think it is significant. I usually start by giving all of my social locations as well as a land acknowledgement, but I was so uptight about time that I cut it out. But it's not an easy question either, because I have changed class during my life, and actually wrote about this with other colleagues, a paper called Conflicts in the Habitus, which Bourdieu talks about in Weight of the World, that habitus isn't as univocal as some applications of Bourdieu would suggest. And one of my parents was lower middle class and the other one was middle class. We were downwardly mobile through my life, but I married someone from the upper middle class. So it's complicated, and it would have taken 10 more minutes.
I suspect for each of us that would be a complicated issue. And I think that it also depends on the context in which we're speaking. So this kind of context, I think perhaps, well, I assumed it wasn't the place to try and tell you what my class position was and what it has been and what it will be and what it is in different circumstances. In other places, then maybe it would be relevant. But I think it really, really depends on what we're doing with it performatively. And we know the difference between what it would be to talk about our class in the clinic, which I think some of us as analysts would do, and some of us as analysts would not do. The difference between that and the way we engage in political action outside the clinic, it's performative. It locates us and it does some things. So I think that's maybe why my excuse for not talking about it tonight.
Thanks both. I might come back if no other questions come through in the meantime to another of the ones that was put there. But
I think, Elizabeth, did you want to respond to that? I think it's not...
Yeah, I just had to unmute myself. It reminds me of something when I was teaching, and we talk a lot about trigger warnings. And one thing I would often say at the beginning of class is like, look, I'm very opinionated, especially in my policy classes. And then I would talk about being opinionated as a privilege, right? And that I felt allowed to say pretty much whatever I wanted to say. And it also was, you know, sort of the higher the class, the more perceived freedom you have, right? It's sort of like the higher one is in a corporation, the more benefits one gets. Even if the lower one is in a corporation, the more actual hands-on work one does. So it was always an interesting discussion about whether the students felt that they could be opinionated out loud, even though they knew they had opinions. And I think it was a statement of privilege, if not so much class, that I would say, look, I'm very opinionated. It's just a thought.
thanks. That's a nice way to address it. I like that. Emily Weinweber has sent through a question. Has anyone found a way to bring in more group or collective care into a private practice therapy setting, or is that purely idealistic? So I guess that could be any of you in your practice, or any sources that we know about from historical practice as well.
Well, okay. I was reluctant to jump in there, but I'm aware that Dick Blackwell is here from a tradition of psychoanalysis which works explicitly with groups. Group analysis perhaps is one of those spaces for being able to realize the group dimension, the collective dimension in the therapeutic work. Now, when I did my training, I had to make a choice between group analysis as the place that seemed to be the collective option, or to train as a Lacanian psychoanalyst, where it seemed to me that we are we understand ourselves as social beings through our relation to language. Now, the choice I made to go into Lacanian psychoanalysis, I think embedded me in a kind of social collective conception of what identity is. That's the positive side of it. But the negative side is that I see people one-to-one in the clinic. And that, of course, reproduces the individualistic conceptions of subjectivity that bedevil us now in neoliberalism. So I think there's something that group analysis has to add to this mix, which I think is really important in therapeutic work.
Yeah, can I just add something? I didn't have the choice of group analysis or individual because we don't learn anything about groups here in the United States. There was not a single course in my training, and I don't think there's many in many institutes that are focused on the group. And I think that is another way that class is reproduced in our institution. It's an institutional form of a normative unconscious process that groups are. And there's such rich group analytic traditions. It also enables people to act out in horrific individualistic ways in institutions. Another piece of what I had hoped to talk about if I had time was how our conferences. I was going to talk about a particular enactment of classism in a conference, but the whole thing is an enactment of classism because you learn at these conferences how to be white and upper middle class, whether you are or you're not. And I would recommend this doesn't speak to the group issue, but it does speak to the class issue. An article that one of my colleagues wrote, Elizabeth Korpt, called Peasant in the Analyst's Chair, about what it feels like to be working class in upper class institutions that assume that the upper class subject is the universal subject.
Thanks. I just wanted to mention something too, if I may. Vincent de Gorjac's book on class neurosis, which I mentioned before, which is not yet available in English translation, but hope that it will be in the not too distant future. There he talks about, it's a research. It uses this tool, the genogram or the genosociogram, as a research technique rather than as a clinical technique. But I know that it is used in analytically and systemically informed family therapies, for example. And that really involves sort of looking with a family group or a couple at the social origins of their generational history and what kinds of psychic transmissions have taken place as a result of class transitions, social mobility, upward or downward, and how those dynamics map onto, Oedipal and other kinds of dynamics in the clinic as well. So that's something that I found really interesting as a potential tool. There is a question from Alex Reynolds. Any thoughts on how to sensitively raise, name, and explore class in the consulting room when it's implicit in the material rather than explicit?
Well, I would just say, in the clinical material I gave, it wasn't explicit. I was listening for it, possibly because of what I was saying before about my own crazy class formation. I'm attuned to class. It's not like my patient said, I'm working class and I want to be upper class. It was not explicit in the room, but became something that we could talk about.
Yes, I agree. I think the key question here is the listening rather than the introducing of topics which reflect the analyst's own presuppositions or their own preoccupations. There are certain things that we attend to, there's certain things that we listen for. So, of course, because of my political involvement and interest in intersectional approaches to class and race and gender and sexuality, I listen for these things. Maybe I listen more acutely for them in the clinic, but it's that listening, I think, is the key, to be ready for when an analysand will introduce those signifiers, those connotations, those hints themselves, and to be able to mark them so that they are clearly being listened to and witnessed, so that the analysand themselves can develop those things rather than us frame them and interpret them and impose our own understandings. I think the same applies in relation to class as it does to other questions of oppression, or indeed to any other questions of subjectivity that someone is bringing into the clinic.
Thanks, Ian. I would maybe like to ask a question to Elizabeth first, but of course everybody's welcome to respond. You've all talked a little bit about money and the role that money plays in the clinical relationship and its relation, possibly or sometimes explicitly, to class questions. Elizabeth, in your talk, you referred to the practices that were in place in the free clinics around money and some of the discussions as well that were had there about how to handle it. And I wondered if you could maybe say a little more about the texture of some of those discussions.
Yeah, well, yeah, thanks. Those are some of the things that I found quite surprising. A lot of this data comes from reports from the institutes that were related to the clinics. Some people have written about it very specifically, like Ernst Simmel. This interests me because of the effort to disengage the fee from the treatment. And so from the very beginning, in Vienna, well, Vienna spearheaded this, but actually Budapest, the members of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society who were interested devised very specific ways of supporting the clinic on their own, in part so that the patient's ability to pay or not pay would not interfere with the analysis. So they have this very specific formula of 1 in 5 patients was to be treated for free. They had fundraising schemes. They did all sorts of things so that treatment would be based on diagnosis and not on the ability to pay, which of course means that the first generation of analysts were very aware of the class projections. In other words, if you are able to pay, then you are a better person or an upper class person or more like me, so you and I can relate. Conversely, if you're not able to pay, then you and I are different, and perhaps so different that you'll never understand the process of psychoanalysis, which brings to mind Lynne's talk on neoliberalism, precisely. So it's just, it's interesting that you can read these people talking about precisely that, about separating out these two issues. I hope that answers to some extent. And Reich was definitely there.
Yeah, I think it is very interesting how the sort of techniques of decoupling the fee from fee and diagnosis sort of allow the question of money not to cloud the therapeutic relationship or the analytic relationship, at least in the first instance, right?
Yeah, and also this phrase of Eitingon's that people will pay as much as they can or think they can, right? Because often, wealthy people can think, oh, I can only afford $5, and that will tell you a lot, right? Or people are embarrassed because they think they can't pay enough or can't pay at all. Whereas in fact, there's a trust fund somewhere. So those are really deep clinical issues. So to acknowledge from the get-go that a person thinks they can only pay so much, that there's a dissonance there between the reality of what they can pay and what they think they can pay. And
Yeah.
that's a clinical issue.
Which says something, exactly, something
Right,
possibly
yeah.
symptomatic, yeah. I don't know if the audience members have any questions they'd like to bring up. I have a bunch of questions, but I don't want to abuse my rights as chair.
I just wanted to ask something actually, just following on from what Elizabeth was saying, which was a sort of converse problem that we, or not a problem perhaps, but a question that we often sort of tackle at the Red Clinic, but haven't resolved, which is the impact of trying not to work within the capitalist framework, and the impact is, as Kat said, of sort of clouding, potentially sort of affecting the transference by events such as this, or being quite open about our politics, and that this can have an impact, I think, in a range of ways. Clinically, one of them being the sort of invitation for patients to feel that we're the good people, the bad things are out there in society, and we're aligned. We're comrades here, and so forth. That's just to say one, but there are sort of multiple ways, I think, which is perhaps not possible. I suppose we're talking really about neutrality here, that it's not possible to escape this, as you say, clouding of the clinical.
Right, and that that brings up another issue, which also is really interesting, and I guess sort of a piece of what also Lynne was talking about in that the neoliberalism has become so ingrained as a cultural value, and part of that is that what is free or inexpensive or on a sliding scale must be of lower quality, right? So if we position ourselves and say, well, a clinic with a sliding scale of fees, then might be, well, they can't give it away, so they can't be any good. So how to be respected, clinically, while having a sliding scale of fees, really speaks to kind of shared values, and to what extent do we examine those values within ourselves.
I thought it was really interesting, the point that you raised in your talk, Elizabeth, about the polyclinics working on the assumption that it's what people think they're able to pay, which is important, which is very different from the ways that some people have been dealing with sliding scales here in Britain, at least. They sometimes been working on a means tested assumption, as if they know what it means to people. And I suppose what people think they can pay can then be explored in the analysis as they start to access many things that they didn't think they thought about what they could pay.
Precisely, yes, exactly, precisely, yeah. I think it's complicated and it's interesting, and Eitingon talks about it, he says that belongs in the treatment room. That's not part of the admissions process.
Yeah.
And also for the clinicians, then that, people were admitted, they say specifically based on diagnosis alone. And Reich was very much, very concerned that be the admission criteria. And then, of course, when they started admitting children to the Child's Guidance Center, it was what could the parents pay or not pay.
There's an interesting comment from Joanna in the chat, which I just wanted to share viva voce. She says that the setting up of free clinics or low-cost clinics is one of the most important forms of collective and sometimes Marxist or socialist psychoanalytic activism, and that there have been many instances of these in different forms around the world, which are quite under-theorized, potentially also on the global level. And she just points to a special issue of Psychoanalysis and History from 2022 that's devoted to this type of work based on an online conference on free clinics. So I just wanted to share that for everyone who might want to go and look at that journal.
That is open access, isn't it? So we can all look at it.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
There also was a special issue, Division 39 of the American Psychological also recently published a special issue on community psychoanalysis. And I can send you a link if you want that.
That would be great. Thanks. We could maybe share it in the YouTube chat afterwards as well.
Can I ask a question based on what Joanna was saying? Because this is something that sort of troubles me. Joanna, you talk about the work of such clinics challenges many aspects of mainstream theory and practice. I have often wondered, just as a lot of Black analysts are challenging not just the exclusionary forms of psychoanalysis institutionally, but the very theory. I'm wondering if we can really assume that the theory itself isn't class-based, consciously or unconsciously. Is it really an anodyne theory of, Ian spoke about listening. Listening seems to be crucial here, but I just wonder, I hear so often now when there's racism challenges in my institution, for example, I hear so often people in power saying, well, we have a curriculum that's kind of like pure gold, and we can add a couple articles on race or class or whatever, but it's pure gold. And I do not think that that is how a lot of Black theoreticians think about psychoanalytic theory. I've heard many people say, I couldn't read half the pieces that I was assigned in my training because it was depleting and exhausting. So that's my question. Joanna, maybe you want to answer that.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn, for that. I absolutely agree with you 100% about that. And I mean, I think there are some people who try to look at the very concepts of psychoanalysis and whether they embody certain versions of consciousness and rationality and what it is to be a mature human that are indeed very, once you start thinking about it, very class-based, very race-based. I think there has been more work done on that from the point of view of race and class, on whiteness, and as with a lot of this thinking about class, I think people who've written about race and racism in relation to psychoanalysis have provided us with theoretical and models or approaches of how to deconstruct psychoanalysis. And I think, there's an awful lot to learn from that. I mean, one, maybe, I don't know if it's quite right to pick this up, but one assumption that a lot of, well, I mean, part of what you said about the pure gold, I mean, is absolutely riven with capitalist ideology, you know, pure gold and copper alloys of Freud, and that's riven the whole field right from the beginning in a very biased way as regards psychoanalysis that's more inclusive or more challenging of who comes to psychoanalysis. But I think one issue that I haven't really ever found a very good way of talking about it is this, what I said about the status of the unconscious, because there is a predominant psychoanalytic line that the unconscious is not marked by class or gender or any of those kind of characteristics. And I think that was raised right at the beginning. I think it's open to question that, and a lot of the clinical work that we do would absolutely suggest otherwise in the force of the impact of such parts of life, really, in the construction of subjectivity. But I think there's an awful lot more to think about in that respect.
I think we are going to have to finish shortly. Luke, am I right?
That's right, yes.
I'd like to maybe just point, there's a discussion happening on the chat, which I think is important, about working class inclusion, if you like, or participation of working class therapists in the profession, analysts, and so on, and the sort of prohibitively expensive costs of training as a psychoanalyst. And I don't know if any of our speakers might have something to say to that point before we finish.
Well, yes, I suppose we can see a kind of pyramid of expertise or supposed expertise in the therapeutic world, in which class relations are replicated in the relations between psychoanalysts, psychotherapists, and counselors. Many, many counselors are doing psychoanalytic work, but are not recognized as being psychoanalytic by the psychoanalysts who are at the top of the pyramid, the top of the class pyramid. So we've got an institutional question here about the way that psychoanalysis operates in relation to other approaches. And I think one of our tasks is to open the domain of discussion about psychotherapy and counseling, which opens it to different voices, working class voices, Black voices, feminist voices, voices of peoples from different parts of the world. And that is a question that raises the kind of issues that Lynne was drawing attention to, which is that there are other alternative ways of working with subjectivity. Maybe they're not psychoanalytic, but that's fine. We need to open space for people to be able to come into psychoanalysis and make use of it, but also to be able to walk away from it and do other things as well.
I think that there's so much more to be said about those issues, and the sort of sociological point about how class operates as a gatekeeper of the profession within the sort of breadth of professions associated with psychoanalytic thinking, as well as in the patient therapist dyad is really very, very rich, and we could talk about that for another half an hour, I'm quite sure. But I do think we have to close. I'd like to then just conclude by saying a very big thank you to our three speakers, Elizabeth Danto, Lynne Layton, and Ian Parker. This was a bit of a dream for me, actually, to get the three of you and to have Joanna participating as well in the audience, talking together about this topic. So thanks very much for agreeing to participate tonight and for giving some great papers. Very much enjoyed that.